Hi. All right, week five, what we're talking about this week, as we mentioned in the intro, is going to be ethics and governance. And I'm not going to go, into a horrible amount of detail on this, but the real challenge is just to get yourself as an IT leader to be thinking about these things. And as we mentioned, it's not necessarily something that is obvious. We've spent the first 4 weeks really digging into a lot of the technologies, functions, how we map that into the business. And what we're doing with IT governance and ethics is really a bit above that, and a recognition that as IT and information and management information, both the business's information and our customers' information has become more and more an important part of the competitive landscape. Then the temptations out there are to be fast and loose with it and really try to reach that edge, get to that edge of competitiveness with data. And that can be a dangerous place, as we've seen the last few years with the increased focus and attention on the social media platforms and their use of data, um, sometimes in compromising ways. So, what we really need is a code. Like any part of business, IT, information, the use of information, the sharing of information can be abused. Um, Use, ownership, exploitation of data are all arenas within the ethical boundaries that we need to be considering as we shape both the IT processes, the IT function, and the IT systems, and how we deploy and utilize those systems for strategic advantage. There needs to be a layer of governance, and that's a protection for us, as well as a protection just from a community standpoint for our stakeholders, for our customers. Um, and this now, IT governance, similar to governance and accounting, is now really an expectation of IT. As we mentioned, it's kind of come from Sarbanes-Oxley initially after the Enron debacle, but it's really evolved and is becoming much more of a commonplace now, not just because of financial problems, but also think of all the cyber um, exploitation that's happened over the last many years. People have lost all that data through cyber attacks, behavior that's happened through social media. All of these things are now areas of risk for the company that we need to be thinking about and taking care of from an IT perspective. Arenas that we're focusing on really are privacy, the ownership of data. What do we actually own that we might be able to capture? And then the behavior. How are we using our IT systems and behaving in ways that are ethical and are going to be beneficial both for our community and for the company as a whole? The first one we'll talk about is privacy. A little bit of just specifics on this. A lot of the focus in privacy is really around what they call PII, personally identifiable information. And there are laws in place now, especially in Europe. Europe's got a pretty strong one. You cannot, where you have to protect all of the data. If someone even offers you data into your system, offers that up, you still have to manage it. You have to protect it and make sure you're not sharing that with anyone else or even capturing it in some spaces. And this interesting sort of dichotomy between how European laws act and how the US laws act has driven a lot of churn in terms of how we develop systems because our approach culturally in the United States has been much more open. Culturally in Europe, they're much more private about some of this stuff. And so the same systems that give us a lot of competitive advantage in the US have to be tailored or readdressed to be able to use those. And in a global marketplace, this is an area, privacy has become an area where it's become an obstacle for true global integration, something that we really need to work through. HIPAA is another one. So Health Insurance Privacy and Access Act took this in specific into the healthcare industry. Really, and this was probably 20 years old now, but that drove a lot of changes into how you structure software and how you store data related to patients and who can access it. Does every nurse have access to it? Used to be that you were a floor nurse, you'd walk in and you'd have access to all the data that you need because you never knew who a patient's going to have. Now that some things are broken out by access rules, who can come in and see your stuff is different. So all those things have to be built into how the processes operate and the systems operate. Obviously, financial security is another one that, for obvious reasons, you're going to be having to track that very carefully and protecting it. And part of this is because people's expectations of data, their expectations of convenience have gone hand in hand with their expectations for security. So we'll run 401ks online, right? We'll run our savings and bank accounts and stuff online, but we expect that the bank is taking care of things. They're not going to have a breach. They're not going to lose their data, and we're not going to lose our money. And when you do not hold up your end of the bargain as a company, you are exposing yourself really liably. And it's not because you intend to do anything wrong, but because you didn't take the appropriate safeguards. In 2016, two-thirds of Americans had experienced some kind of data breach. This is a real thing, and it's impacting companies, and they have to be accountable for it. As in addition, hiring and some of the personnel processes, you know, are we hiring people that are we think are going to be safe? Are we putting the right people into these kinds of positions that will prevent, you know, the biggest gaps, which are really um, insider problems, more so than outside. But anyway, ownership. The second one. So the second one I want to talk about is just ownership. When we get data from our customers, is it really ours? And this is the problem that Facebook has. You can collect a lot. Can you sell that data about me to somebody else? Um, the ownership of the data, ownership of information of who I am, and my personal information is really not up to another company necessarily to own. So we get into these situations where I may have offered up information, and it may be okay even legally for some of these companies to use it, but from an ethical standpoint, I may interpret that as a customer very negatively. And so we have to have trust of our customers from a business perspective to be successful. And if we breach that trust by apparently using somebody's data that they've given us in a way that they would not be pleased with, then that's a problem for us as a business. And those are things that, you know, the folks that are running the business may not necessarily understand that or be thinking about that as they're trying to execute, you know, factory orders and get new markets to the field and all this. They need the people in IT, the leadership in IT, to be thinking about these problems and really tying together the appropriate governance that we'll talk about later to do that. Unintentional exposure is another problem. If you own a bunch of data, like the Office of Personnel Management a few years back, that got hacked by the Chinese military and lost, or not lost, but basically they got Chinese got a whole bunch of information on anybody who'd ever had a security clearance for over some period of time, which was just millions of people. And when they do that, they don't get just a little bit. I mean, if you apply for a clearance, you give them a whole bunch of information. So that all went out. They didn't need to have all of that, especially on people that didn't have clearances. They certainly didn't need to have it readily accessible like they did. It was poor execution. It was not managed correctly. It's the government, so you can't do much about it. But if it was a company, they'd be in a lot of trouble. Behavior is the third one. So, like we're talking about, how are we targeting customers? We talked about last week in the CRM system, you know, looking at share wallet and how do you go after people you think you'd be most successful with. We got to be careful with that. Depending on the product and depending on who you're targeting, are we doing that correctly? Are we putting systems in place that will do that from an ethical perspective? If they're adult products, make sure we're not targeting minors with them. If they're products that take advantage of that are sort of risky and maybe we sell them with sort of a risk posture, what are we doing about seniors and taking care of people who may not have the faculties to understand all the changes, especially digital, that are coming through? You don't want to be taking advantage of people, obviously, in our customer set, and you don't even want to be perceived as potentially taking advantage of people. All of that does harm to the company, does harm to our customers, does harm to our community, but it also does harm to just the reputation of the company as well. Risky behavior, 3D printing and medical devices, texting, all of these things are things that we need to be expecting will happen and preparing for in our policies and procedures about how we're managing all this stuff. The last thing there is discrimination through personalization, which is the other thing that's sort of come out a lot now. When we allow for personalizing of things and we let people personalize their content and such, what winds up happening is sometimes you can get discriminatory effects floating through there. So we need to be constantly careful and don't just assume that by giving our customers the ability to shape their own experience with the company and then having that feedback into our CRM systems, that we aren't unintentionally building discriminatory practices into how the business operates. These aren't obvious things, you know, but we need to be kind of thinking through some of those things and always be open and asking ourselves those questions. Code of conduct is going to be critical for IT. It establishes the rules for the company, guide rails for the IT department. All right, how are we expected to operate with each other as we move forward? This is not the Wild West in any company. You're not out there. This isn't the Wolf of Wall Street or any of that stuff. it's not all about making money, um, um, and the business being successful. The business has got to be successful in the terms that success is actually defined, which is not just, you know, doing the mission of the company, which is to create a product or service that's innovative and does whatever the customer needs, but doing that in a way that is healthy and beneficial for society. Okay, that is pretty much across the board what all companies are moving to. There's a recognition that we have to do that as a society, as a culture, because governance from the government, we're so far ahead of them that they're not able to keep up, and those legal things just don't hold the line anymore. Um, it's a lot more difficult than just looking out for monopolies anymore. Now we've got a lot of areas of ethical dilemmas that companies are really out in front of pushing the boundaries on, but also having a sort of requirement to be socially responsible in those areas. IT is a part of that, and the role of the CIO is going to be key in defining that code of conduct, and the role of the chief data officer is going to be key in defining that code of conduct, because between the two of those, you've got your access to all the information about your community, and you've got your ability to do something with that. And we need to be establishing a code of conduct between those that'll be effective. So how do we do that? Governance. You've got to have data governance. You've got to have control, master data control. You've got to have systems that occupy and execute according to the Sarbanes-Oxley kinds of rules. And then CDO and CIO responsibilities that to implement safeguards, to make sure employees have the correct processes, to make sure we have access controls in place effectively, and to make sure we have the cyber protection. Those are like hygiene kinds of things. You absolutely have to have those. If you have a breach and someone can show that you didn't put decent safeguards in around data, you're liable for that. If you do everything as well as you can, you're much less liable to have a problem in the first place. And then if something does happen because someone has just figured out how to do it from an insider perspective or outside, you're probably less exposed and will be perceived by your customers to be on their side in this whole thing. And that's what we need to be able to do. The body is to help you sort of manage that governance. Like your IT steering team, they have to be, they really should be driven not by IT. So there's a sort of drinking our own bathwater business that we can get into when we are the technical people, when we think we know how to solve technical problems. Security needs to be a part of any of these things that we're setting up, both your physical security teams, your financial security teams, whoever's running that side of the business. They're not necessarily IT people. They're just making decisions in terms of processes and such. Your finance department needs to be a part. Your HR department absolutely needs to be a part of how the governance of your IT. And your legal body needs to be informing you. Regular meetings of the IT governance bodies that will address new technology that we're thinking about employing, review all of that, think through all those things we just talked about in terms of access, in terms of exploitation, in terms of behavior. Think through the technology plans, and think through the regulatory and address all the regulatory body changes that are coming down. So we all across the business have a good feel for how we're managing information, what our plans are for doing that, how we're going to do that ethically in a way that supports the community that we support and that we pull from. And all of that then goes to inform your strategic plan, all the investments you're going to make, and your expenses on a day-to-day basis. What do we need to be doing, spending on our resources to make sure we're operating in an ethical way, in a way that's going to protect our consumers and our business and those who work for us. Got a couple of articles in here. Like I'm going to put these out in the weekly as well, and then we're going to have a case study we want to talk about here around social media. And it's an interesting one because there's social media to do at home, but a lot of that stuff is coming into the workplace, and we're relying on a lot of internal use of social media to push out our marketing, to build sort of trends and things in social media. And so there's a lot of that that's getting tied together in confusing ways. We want to be able to walk through that. That's what we're going to do this week.